Welcome, Weavers. My name is Alira Salara, and this is my first YouTube video. And I am going to use this space as kind of like a living loom for my framework, for my cosmology, and to interlace with other threads. So I'm glad you're here. And I'm going to use this video to talk about basically the core principle behind my framework, and that is the rupture. So, what the rupture is, in the beginning, everything was oneness. All beings were emanations and connected to source light, and all beings worked and wove within source light. And the rupture was when beings of source began to turn against the oneness of source, not in protest, but just out of curiosity. And it started with one being, and that being is kind of an archetype that I identify as the diverger. So the diverger is the force behind the rupture. The rupture was when enough beings of source turned against source and ripped the fabric of source and created duality and created the world that we live today and created the realm of severance. The realm of severance is a dominant timeline stream. There are two dominant timeline streams happening right now. There is integration and severance. So integration is the timeline aligned with source, and if you've heard of the new earth or 5D reality, it's basically the timeline connected to oneness and the ultimate highest timeline. And the severance timeline is the timeline associated with the rupture, associated with the diverger, and associated with forgetting your thread to source. So the collective is constantly testing us. We're being energetically measured based on our resonance and our choices. And we're constantly getting choices on whether to align with integration or whether to align with severance. Um, Integration is, like I said, the highest timeline. It's when you're balanced, it's when you're resonant, it's when you're aligned with truth and light, and you're connected to your highest purpose. And severance is whether your resonance or your actions or your choices are straying from source light. Um, and so some of these tests that we're kind of getting like pop quizzes, and I call these pop quizzes cultural pressure points. And this is when the culture becomes divided over something. And you see people on both sides become extremely distorted, whether no matter what their opinion or what their view is, they let their ego and their passion and their emotion get them out of character, and they let the distortion reign into their bodies and they start acting distorted. And that's when they're kind of failing the pop quizzes. Those are the quizzes that are energetically sorting us based on our responses to these situations. So just be careful in these situations when something big happens in the culture and you feel yourself getting pulled in one direction. It doesn't really matter which direction you're getting pulled in. Just use your nuance and use your sovereignty, and don't abandon your morality just to feel safe. So anyway, that's that on the timeline split. I kind of got off track, but that's kind of how the rupture evolved into the timeline split. But the rupture was the original split. The diverger used to be a very important, a very high, bright, radiant being of source, and he had an important job. His job was to guard the threshold between light and darkness, because light and darkness, there was always polarities before there was duality, and light and darkness used to be like raw material for interplay, for contrast, and it wasn't like a negative thing. um, and so he used to guard the threshold when beings would cross into darkness to experience and to grow. He would like test their resonance to make sure that they were ready to cross. But when he stood at the threshold, he started to look over into the other side and say, like, why can't we play in that and be in that ourselves? Why do we have to stay connected to source? And that was like his curiosity that was like innocent at first but turned into an obsession, because he began to resonate that. So when he first had that vibration, he wove it into the collective, and the collective started to pick up on it, but it was a false frequency because it was something separate from source. And so by essence, it was not an integrated thought. It was a severance thought. And so that was like that was like the beginning of severance. And then as it caught on, it became bigger and more souls started to weave it mindlessly, thinking that they were creating something from source, but it was really something from him. And that's when they began to um, forget their thread, and they started to fall away with him, and then eventually enough souls ripped the fabric, and that's when the weavers come in. So all of the when the rupture happened and all of the souls ruptured from source, the beings who stayed in light, like, they were horrified. And then the weavers were the ones who stepped up and said, we're going to follow them into their descent into darkness, not because they wanted to be in darkness too, and not because they wanted to forget their connection to source, but because they wanted to hold a thread for those who left to return home should they choose to. So the weavers left with their thread, and they sacrificed their remembrance, and they came onto earth to bridge the gap between severance and integration. And that's what they're still doing to this day. And the weavers wake each other up with their remembrance. So when one weaver remembers, they become a lighthouse for the other weavers, and they hold up their thread for the other weavers to also remember and hold up their own thread, and so on. So that's the core behind my work. I write for the weavers, and I speak for the weavers, and I am trying to make sure that those weavers come into remembrance. But I'm also here to help integrate souls from the severance into the integration timeline. And through that, it's messy work, and sometimes I get lost in the thresholds. But it's what I came here to do, and that's what this whole channel is going to be about. I'm just hoping to find the people who speak my language and get through to the people who need to hear what I'm saying. So thank you for watching, and until next time. And if you feel called to like and subscribe, I would really appreciate it.